everyone, and welcome back to Titanic Talkline. It's Alexia, and before we get into my interview with Dan Parks, I want to talk to you really quickly about the content. Like in previous episodes, we talk about trauma and suicide in relation to the officers that did and did not survive the sinking, but unlike previous episodes, it's not really just one little part you can skip. It's kind of a whole episode, so if you're just not in the place for that today, I totally understand. There's a lot going on, so come back to it when you can, because it's really, really informative, and just a really good episode, and Dan himself is an absolute delight, so maybe not today, but when you're ready, give us a listen, and I hope that those of you who are sticking with us, you enjoy the conversation. Oh, well, I am so excited to have you on, and I say that a lot, but I really am, and I'll get into exactly why later, but would you please tell everyone who you are and a little bit about your journey to Titanic?
Well, I'm Dan Parks. I'm a Titanic enthusiast, researcher, website author, filmmaker, all of that. And I mean, do you want me to go back to how it all started? I mean, that could be a long story, but I mean, it actually goes back to 1988. I can pinpoint the exact moment because it was, I mean, the wreck was discovered in 85, but I somehow my interest was in Halley's Comet, which flew past in 85. So I kind of didn't really register the wreck discovery. And, but then a little bit later, they started showing films on TV because of the wreck being discovered. And I happened to watch SOS Titanic, which is possibly the worst Titanic film ever made. And at the time, I thought so. I was 9 years old, a 9-year-old watching this film. I just kept saying to my father, "When does it sink?" That's all I knew. And of course, it was quite disappointing. And then a few months later, I was living in Australia at the time, Surfers Paradise, Gold Coast. I found a book where you can build a cardboard model of the Titanic, and it's like 1.5 meters long. And I thought, oh, that's great. So I bought the book, and I started building it. And the book was constructed, so as you built it, you learnt about different parts of the ship.
Oh, that's cool.
So, if you're constructing the bridge area, you're learning about all the officers, for example. So I actually started learning the history as I built the model, and by the time I'd finished, I knew the history. And to cut a long story short, I was only 12 years old by that stage, and I started touring schools, giving Titanic presentations, Rotary Club, all that kind of thing, and I became known as Mr. Titanic locally. So that's probably the short version.
That's incredible. And I reached out to you because I just hit my desk, but sort of the crux of my Titanic story was I saw the Cameron film in theaters when I was young. And, the scene comes along where Murdoch commits suicide, and I had never been confronted with that concept before as a child, and I wanted to pause the theater and ask a million questions about why that had happened. And then later on, learning that Cameron had issued an apology, not rectifying, but acknowledging the damage that he had done to his legacy, it, to me, taught a very important lesson, which is that fiction has very, very deep roots and can be very impactful of people's perception of history, even.
But then the question is, was it fiction?
Right.
Because Cameron actually based it on eyewitness accounts. This is something that the tabloid headlines were that, Murdoch's family had been wronged and Cameron had to apologize. Actually, neither of those two things really happened. The family really, First Officer Murdoch doesn't actually have any direct descendants. They didn't have children. It was Ada, his wife, said it was one of their greatest regrets, as they never had children. So there are actually no descendants per se. You just have like uncles and great uncles, and it's one of these uncles that lived in or near Dalbeattie, Scotland, which is Murdoch's home. Was asked about the film, and I don't think he's even watched it, and was unhappy about it. So, I think he said he may have read the script or something, but I don't think he had even watched it. But there was a local resident by the name of Richard Itkins who got up in arms, set up a website. And so the media covered it as the family being terribly upset. Well, actually, I don't know who that really was. I don't think there was anyone. I mean, it's interesting that you say it sparked your interest. I mean, it did with me as well, because in my day job, I'm a filmmaker and soundtrack collector. So watching James Cameron's film was like this convergence of all these interests, you know, Titanic, filmmaking, James Horner's brilliant score. I mean, I was just in heaven. You know, I literally could not speak for like an hour after watching the film. I was just like dumbfounded, because it just took me into some other place. But like you, I was shocked by the suicide scene. I had a general idea about the officers, because I've always been interested in the sort of command center, the bridge area. But I didn't know much about Murdoch, and so that's why I began researching his life, and I've set up the website williammurdoch.net, which is based on a monograph that I wrote, and I sent it to James Cameron, actually. He didn't reply personally, but I did get one of those like little signed pictures that they send fans.
Sure.
But you know, for those listening and who've probably heard about the controversy about the suicide scene, actually he didn't just make that up. It was based on eyewitness accounts, and his intent was not to portray him as a coward or anything of that nature. In fact, he wanted to portray him as a hero that was in a dilemma, and this kind of sort of conflict of interest that took place. Obviously, a suicide and a shooting, as portrayed, are very negative things, but I think that the media twisted it into far more sort of a negative slant. And my research concludes that we're pretty sure that actually an officer did shoot passengers and committed suicide. The question actually isn't that, it's who. And we can narrow it down to either Murdoch or Chief Officer Wilde as the most probable. And you'll find that there are lots of people with different views on that. So my opinion is that yes, an officer did shoot passengers and commit suicide. We just don't know who.
Mm-hmm. I think maybe what affects people so much, at least I spend a lot of time on Reddit, but I see that I think for most people it's because the person who's killed in question isn't just a bystander in the crowd, it's one of the minor characters. So it feels more impactful, I believe, to an audience, and it feels a little bit more intentional in a way, because I saw the movie recently, and a man jumps from a higher portion, I don't remember exactly where, I think maybe the top of the officers' quarters, into the crowd, which causes a rush forward. And the person that's shot is Tommy, the Irish friend of the third class group. So it may have been that it was that character instead of just some person in the crowd. I don't know. That's speculation. You
know, I think you're right. The other thing is he also portrays a kind of bribery scenario where Culloden Hockley just kind of slips money into his pocket. He doesn't kind of openly take it, but it's kind of imputed. And then he throws the money back at him. But obviously, there's absolutely zero evidence of any bribery. I mean, Murdoch was an incredibly honourable and quite heroic officer, in my opinion. So I think he did go a step too far there. But I personally, as a filmmaker, think that you have to make creative decisions. I mean, the whole sort of fictional Jack and Rose story is a storytelling device. It's Romeo and Juliet on Titanic, so they can explore the different class structures and the ship and the history and what have you. And so similarly, the portrayal of an officer's suicide, he obviously had to choose which officer, and he made a choice, and he made it Murdoch because he wanted to show the kind of dilemma. You know, there's earlier on when Thomas Andrews says they've only got an hour and a half. I think Captain Smith turns to Murdoch and says, "How many aboard?" To kind of sort of like drive home, you know, what's just happened and the kind of guilt that he's feeling. And I'm sure, I mean, he was an incredibly capable sailor. He must have gone through tremendous trauma. You know, his shift started at 10 o'clock. By 2 o'clock in the morning, you know, he only had a few minutes left and he died. It's a horrendous shift to have, isn't it? So I think he did go through an incredible character arc. And so
absolutely, I
think Cameron made a very interesting choice there. You know, it's a grey zone when you take historical characters and then dramatize it. you know. But I mean, we see it now. There's like the Elves film at the moment. Dramatizing real life characters is fraught with issues.
Right.
But I do think that the Murdoch suicide has been overblown by the media. It was they were cashing in on the popularity of the film. So that's my opinion anyway.
That makes sense, and I agree with you about the bribe, because there was also no need, because Murdoch was the one who was letting men on after the women and children had been boarded, and especially towards the earlier time when there just wasn't anybody on there, that wouldn't have been necessary, that there was no need for a bribe. He wasn't explicitly denying entry to people on the boats.
Yeah, but I think James Cameron, the more you delve into the film, you can see he really did his homework. And one of the interesting things about the starboard evacuation, and Murdoch was in charge of pretty much all the starboard lifeboats that were evacuated, is that there were quite a few men, compared to Lytle on the port side, he wouldn't even let a 14-year-old boy get on a lifeboat. So it was quite a difference, and I'm not at all of the opinion that there was any bribery in this case, but I can see that Cameron was kind of exploring, well, hang on, why were there so many men? Maybe there was some money involved. I mean, they were wealthy men. There isn't any evidence of any bribery that I'm aware of, but I can kind of see as a storytelling device it was an interesting thing to do. But I do think that was the step too far. I don't think the shooting the suicide was, but that was.
Maybe it's in conjecture. If it had been one or the other, perhaps it might have been overlooked, and yeah, I don't know. Like I said, for me, it was impactful just because it made me realize that, you know, I had just taken it as a fact and not even thought twice about whether or not it was or wasn't, because I think I was 8 when I saw the movie, but it was interesting to consider that, how much creative license goes in when you're making something about a historical event of which there is so much past interest and documentation.
Yeah, and you have to be careful as well to make assumptions. And there are a lot of people who look at a shooting suicide and assume that's a very negative thing. Right. I mean, interestingly, when the film came out, not long after, I actually had a friend of mine commit suicide. And so it became quite a personal thing for me, the way that suicides are portrayed. Are they an evil act, or is it a cry for help? Is it where someone, you know, loses hope? There's all these other ways of looking at suicide, you know, and obviously I'm not wanting to push suicide. In fact, my website has some links to help and what have you. But our perception of it, do we think that suicide is a cowardly act? Or is it a mental health issue? Or is it, you know, huge amounts of stress? I mean, Murdoch must have been under incredible stress during those few hours of the evacuation. And the thing is, I think people tend to forget, is that the officers were armed. I mean, Fifth Officer Lowe had his own personal revolver, while the senior officers were all issued, you know, standard White Star Line revolvers. So they were armed, and there were thousands of people who were on the ship and there weren't enough lifeboats for you. It's a crowd control nightmare. To think that there wasn't some kind of gunplay on you know, that night is quite naive, really. So I think, you know, you need to sort of take all those factors into consideration and realize, well, yeah, something did happen. And if you look at the broad spectrum of eyewitness accounts, right across class structures, right across nationalities, age groups, yeah, something did happen.
I mean, you're probably right. As you said, it's such a stressful event, and if you pause for even a second while you're working, just look around and see, you know, what I'm sure is a sea of desperate faces, and you know that the resources are either gone or depleted. I can't imagine that inspires a lot of hope in anybody.
But the problem is that, you know, I'm not going to say that I'm brave or anything like that, but I've been, you know, sticking my neck out and saying, hey, actually, I think something happened. And I've actually had death threats. I've received emails from Scotland saying, watch your back. That's appalling. I'm sorry. Because of that. I mean, you know, I love Scotland. I love Scottish people. But you know, I mean, at the time I was living in Japan, so the death threats weren't too didn't cause much concern. But
fair.
But the kind of the idea that there was actually people out there who were so sort of passionate about this that they felt that I was, you know, besmirching his name or his reputation and what have you. I mean, I can get the passion, but we need to also realize that history isn't, you know, like if we look at it through rose-colored glasses, it does look all fine, but actually the reality of history is that it can be quite grim. And we know that nearly 1,500 people died in the Titanic disaster, and there are all manner of different kinds of deaths that took place. It is a very grim subject. To not realize that there could have been a suicide is a bit naive, I think.
It does seem a bit silly now that I think about it. And I'm reading Stephen Beale's book, Down with the Old Canoe, which is about the cultural history. And it talks about how, especially surrounding the first class men, there was this narrative afterwards about, you know, grace and dignity, gentility. What is it that Gene Wilder says in Young Frankenstein? Quiet, dignity, and grace. That's what I said. And, you know, when you constantly hear that narrative and it gets stuck in your head that everyone just went down quietly singing, you know, gospel hymns together, then the concept of a suicide does seem rather unfathomable because it's in contrast with the narrative. But as you pointed out, you know, it probably was an absolute madhouse of desperation. So that sort of highly charged emotional moment, it seems much more plausible in context.
And I think, yeah, that context is important. I mean, if you look at it, a lot of the men who chose to go down with the ship, and some in cases their wives as well, it was a form of suicide. I mean, they were opting for death when they had a choice for life, but it was a very kind of a different era. I mean, this is pre-World War One. Edwardian society had still that kind of layer of dignity that seemed to be lost with war. And it's kind of interesting. I was researching local history here. I live near New Haven Port in England, and I think not only maybe a year or so before the Titanic disaster, 1910, somewhere around that, there was actually a captain of a ship that collided with another ship near New Haven Port, and he was in the wrong, and he was found to be in the wrong, and he committed suicide. From memory, I think it was a gunshot. So we're looking at a time period where sort of when your reputation is on the line, that this was kind of considered as an option. I mean, it's unthinkable now, but back then it wasn't unusual. Which you can also twist the other way and say, well, because of that, maybe some of these eyewitness accounts were believing it happened when it didn't. You know, that they were sort of projecting their ideals. But, you know, I look at it that actually it wasn't an unusual occurrence.
Right. You know, obviously Murdoch didn't survive the sinking, but, you know, the fate of Frederick Fleet, you know, the lookout who did survive, he ultimately ended up taking his own life. I don't remember how old he was at the time, but he died quite young.
Actually, there were quite a few suicides post Titanic disaster. I mean, you know, we now understand a lot better post-traumatic stress.
Right.
You know, there are, you know, Lightoller, Second Officer Lightoller, said that he couldn't have a bath because the water reminded him of the Titanic disaster. There were lots of stories of people who had a sort of a trauma that they took with their life for the rest of their life, you know, and that's understandable, isn't it? You know, in the case of Murdoch, perhaps it was encapsulated in those few minutes that he had, you know. So, yeah, but it's a grim subject, and I don't want to be the one that's always talking about it. And my interest actually is more broad than just Murdoch. I've actually researched all of the officers, but Murdoch seems to be the most popular, without a doubt.
I think, I'm sure that's in large part due to the Cameron film. I'm sorry, one of our dogs thinks there's going to be a storm. There is not, but she's looking for refuge in the room. I don't know that much about the officers, really, outside of, you know, I'm an enthusiast that does not retain knowledge very well. I love to learn, but the specifics don't exactly sit with me. So what are some of your interests with the officers, or some of the most interesting officers that you don't get to talk about, or some of the facts that people just aren't as interested in? Not that Murdoch isn't interesting. I obviously find him fascinating.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've got this website, TitanicOfficers.com, and it's been fascinating because in that website I've been going in depth on each officer. I'd studied Murdoch in quite a lot of detail for about a decade. And I feel that actually by studying the other officers, I've actually come back to understand him even more. Because when you look at the lives of the other officers, you realise that they were quite similar trajectories in many ways. You know, they had 4-year apprenticeships. They often started off in sail before going into steam. You know, there's all these kind of similarities. And when you look at their life story and then you look back at Murdoch, you can kind of realise actually they had very similar stories to tell. Murdoch's was cut short, but others obviously got a chance to go further. But when it comes to interesting stories, I mean, at the moment I'm researching Arthur Rostrom, who is the captain of the Carpathia, the rescue ship.
Oh, I'm so interested in him. And he was incredible hero.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, again, I'm played devil's advocate on there. He also took some dramatic risks, and he,
yes,
you know, there is actually a case to be made that he took a risk too far. I mean, people could say that Captain Smith took a risk by, you know, not slowing down when icebergs were warned about, but actually Rostron knew about icebergs and sailed straight into them at full speed.
If he hadn't made it, I think it would have been everyone would have been. He was obviously a fool. What loon sails directly into ice? We only talk about him. You're right. We only talk about him in that way because his loon balloon plan happened to work.
Well, that's right. It's retrospective, isn't it? I mean, Smith gets a lot of flack.
You're right.
For being a bad captain. When my research actually, I've become far more open-minded about Smith. I mean, it actually post-Titanic sinking, there were 14 captains who testified under oath to say that they would have done exactly the same as Captain Smith.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, there were 3 inquiries after the sinking, and
I knew the 2.
In the British inquiry, quite a few captains were called forth from similar backgrounds as Smith. Like they'd spent decades on the North Atlantic route, so they knew about ice. On similar ships, we had Captain Pritchard of the Mauretania, who actually, the Mauretania can actually sail at least 3 or 4 knots faster than Titanic ever could. So we're looking at similar captains, similar ability, experience, and what have you. And they all said, well, we would have done the same. And it wasn't just a kind of a camaraderie thing. It's that Smith was following standard procedure and protocol that actually even continued after the sinking. Most people don't realise that. That Smith wasn't doing anything particularly dangerous. Well, Rostron actually was. He did take a huge risk, but because he succeeded in saving 712 lives, obviously he comes out the hero, while Smith becomes the villain. And it's just that toss of the coin.
You're absolutely right. Rostrom just becomes a bit of a maverick, whereas Smith is a dangerous disaster in the reflection.
And the thing interesting about Rostrom, I've been getting in researching his biography just recently, is that he's not, the Titanic obviously is his big story, but he's got a lot of other stories, and one kind of key part of his history is is World War I, and he was very much involved in the Gallipoli part of the war, and he was what they call trooping, which was bringing troops to the Gallipoli shores, and he had some very interesting takes on that I'm going to be bringing out in my biography shortly, where he thinks he knows why the Gallipoli mission was failed and why so many men died. He's got an interesting story to tell, actually.
Care to share a preview of one of those, or do we have to read the book?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, well, watch this space. Stay tuned.
Well, I was just trying to see if I could get a cliff notes for the listeners. That's okay. I'm happy to read the book when it's out.
Well, it will be on the website. Hopefully in the next few months. Along with he also saw a sea monster. It's another part of his interesting story.
Ooh. Was it a sea monster like the Loch Ness Monster, where it turns out to be what we now know is often a grey whale's penis?
I don't know about that, but I do know that when he saw this monster, he got verification. He wasn't just the only one that saw it. In fact, there were even newspaper reports, quite contemporary ones, that also registered the sighting of a sea monster per se. I don't know if it really was a monster, but Yeah, he's even got like pictures he's drawn and what. Yeah, his history is quite interesting. So watch the space.
One other captain that I recently learned a little bit about was the captain of the Californian, Stanley Lord. Was that his name, or did I completely mess it up?
Yeah, no, you've got it right.
Oh wow, cool. There's so many names, but I watched I think it was History's Greatest Mysteries special on the Titanic, and it did focus a little bit on him and sort of exonerated him and the California by, using modern technology and, the way that we now have to be able to look back on these things and make our judgments, to show that it's really unlikely the Californian actually was able to clearly see Titanic, and it's unlikely that they really would have been able to go get it, and he actually was posthumously exonerated, but I guess that's not really discussed very much.
Well, it is discussed a lot, and if you belong to communities like Encyclopedia Titanica, it's discussed ad nauseum.
That one I'm not in.
It's actually probably the number one debate amongst Titanic enthusiasts would be the Californian, whether it saw the Titanic or not. I
believe that.
I mean, for me, I've got a biography coming out on Stanley Lord,
right,
including some audio recordings that he made, which is quite interesting. But
wow.
if my take on it, just briefly, I guess, is that
yes, please.
Actually, if he had responded to the Titanic's distress calls and signals, he wouldn't have made it in time anyway. And that's what the research says, is that even if he had gone full steam to where the Titanic was sinking, there's little he could have done.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, in a way, a moot point. I think the point is that he didn't respond. So whatever ship, even if it wasn't the Titanic, there was obviously a ship firing rockets, which were, okay, they could be company signals, which is the argument that you'll read, but
right,
they were primarily used for distress, and they did not respond. I mean, that's actually not in dispute. That obviously, he slept through it. So
yeah,
there is a case to be made. Well, if there was another ship, they didn't respond to that. My hunch is that they saw the Titanic personally. If I'm going to make a call on it, and I put my head on the on the platter by doing so, I think. But
nobody send Dan a single threat.
Well, it's quite possible.
No one.
But I mean, I haven't finished my biography of Stanley Law, so I'm very open-minded on the subject. I'm happy to look at the other side of it. But that is my hunch, because basically the Titanic saw a ship, and the Californian saw a ship firing distress rockets. If there was another ship firing distress rockets, there was another ship sinking at the same time. So
it's not great either. So
I know it's a far more complex. If you go onto any of the forums, and you'll see thousands of pages devoted to this discussion. It's a subject of great debate. There are like books written that go into great detail, but I think the simple conclusion to the matter is they just didn't respond.
Yeah, and that's a valid point, is that whether or not you could have gotten there, whether you were 6 hours or 6 minutes away, if you saw someone in distress and effectively turned your back, that says a lot about you.
But then again, this is where, also going back to Captain Smith, is that retrospectively we can be quite judgmental, because we're not really seeing it through the eyes that they were at the time. They did not know. I mean, obviously, if Captain Lord and his officers had realized what was happening, would they have done that? Well, of course they would not have. I don't have any doubt on that point at all. But because of the way things happen, these kind of, I mean, it's what makes Titanic, it's such a fascinating story, is that all these sort of, it's full of irony and sort of amazing coincidences, the weather conditions and the angle that the ship hit the ice, but all these kinds of things.
Right.
The Californians also got that, we got a wireless operator who turns his unit off, because that was what happened back then.
It's just normal.
Do we blame people for doing what was just normal, every day. I always say, like, it's a good example is, for many years, cars didn't have seatbelts. Do we blame, all those who are injured or even died in car accidents? Do we blame them for not having seatbelts? Were they deliberately causing injury by doing so? So sometimes it does take, unfortunately, a disaster of this magnitude for things to change. But then do we, in retrospect, need to blame these people for that? Is it negligence? That's another subject of great debate.
I think that's a really good question, though, because again, we have this privilege of looking back from the year, now 2022, where we have forensics and deep sea scanners and special cameras and the ability to do these incredible forensic testing. And, people are figuring out the exact precise angle of brakes, things that you just didn't have the liberty of having back then. And then you take that fresh knowledge and look back and go, well, I think... And it's so easy to judge from where you are now without remembering that everything from the technology to the standards to the way people spoke were completely different than things are now.
Absolutely, yeah, I completely agree.
What is, since you do a lot of officer research, who is the most not underrated, but sort of underappreciated officer of the Titanic?
I'd say without a doubt it's Third Officer Pittman, Herbert Pittman. And there's kind of a good reason for that, and that is that he departed the Titanic quite early on during the evacuation. So his story is quite limited. He wasn't directly involved in the collision sequence. And unlike Lightoller and Boxall and the others that survive, and Lowe, especially Fifth Officer Lowe, right. His involvement was quite limited. He was in lifeboat number 5. It rowed out to a certain distance. He wanted to row back once the ship had sunk, but the passengers weren't happy about it, and he just went along with that. But he's actually a very interesting story. I mean, in my research for the website, you'll notice some pictures there where you can actually see him like breaking down during the U.S. inquiry when he was asked. He was kind of pushed by Senator Smith to kind of describe the sounds of people dying, basically, and you can actually see this photograph where he looks like in pain. It's quite a moving thing, actually, where because I can see from my research he wanted to go back, but he also had passengers that were in his care who said that they did not want to go back. So he's caught in a kind of a catch-22 situation.
You can't win.
And you can kind of see the trauma that he's going through when he's asked about that. And also the sad part of his life is that shortly thereafter, they brought in quite rigid eye tests, and he failed his next eye test. So he actually had to step down as an officer, and he went into the purser's department. It's quite interesting, I think, actually, an officer going into the purser's department, because it's obviously quite. I mean, he's taken all these Board of Trade qualifications for navigation and what have you, and suddenly he's going into the purser's department, so he's dealing with like first class passenger, first world problems. But he apparently did very well, and he his life story as a purser is quite an interesting one in its own right. He actually wrote a personal sort of account of the sinking that's never been publicly released, and I've been trying to. I know who's got it, and I know a little bit about it, but I can't get it publicly released. That's one of my wishes, is that I think if we could get that released, perhaps we'll know a little bit more about him and his story. I do think he has a story to tell. And
I'm sure that he does.
But yeah, Pittman's very much the underrated officer.
He sounds interesting. I mean, they're all interesting, especially when you consider. Like, I don't think that today there is, in the same way, a profession quite like being a professional mariner of the time. Well,
it's interesting you say that, because I had a conversation recently about who are the modern day officers, basically, and I think they're the airline pilots.
Okay,
because
that's fair.
The Titanic was an immigration ship. It wasn't a cruise ship. People you often get this mixed up because cruise ships just cruise.
Yes.
Like Titanic was an immigration ship. It was also a Royal Mail steamer, so it had cargo. It was about the fastest way of getting from A to B. So it was mass movement of people and goods. And, it wasn't a cruise ship. They did try to make it as luxurious and as nice as possible, but it wasn't about cruising. And obviously when, aircraft technology took off, thanks mostly to World War One, and jet aircraft were developed, that suddenly took over. So the fastest way and easiest way of getting people and cargo to other countries became the jet aircraft. And you'll see, captains, pilots with the stripes on their shoulders which show their rank, just like the officers on board Titanic. So I think that then they are now the sort of the modern day ship officers, because the ship officers that you meet now are most likely going to be cruise ship officers, and it's quite different. Yes. They're not going to, all the Titanic officers were R&R, Royal Naval Reserve officers. They had military training. So they had training in torpedoes and using guns and all that kind of thing. So, you're very unlikely, I think, to get a ship's officer studying now. But you never know.
It would be fascinating to come with a checklist of everything that a Titanic officer used to have to do, and just corner your nearest cruise officer and be like, "Excuse me, do you know how to do these things?" But what did that was fascinating to me. What did it take to be an officer of the 1910s? What all did you have to know before?
Well, it wasn't something you could just become. It was quite a few years of training. It started off with an apprenticeship of 4 years, and in the case of pretty much all of the Titanic's officers, that was on a sailing ship. For many of them, it was a ship called the Conway, and Conway, and after that 4 years, you then could start getting a paid job, and you then needed a qualification. And so there was Board of Trade qualifications, and the first one was known as the second mate, and then you had first mate, and then you had masters, and then you had extra masters. And the interesting thing, actually, looking at the Titanic officers, is that pretty much all of them failed in one of those exams, except one officer who never failed any exam. Can you guess who?
I'm going to try. I'm going to say that it was Lightoller.
No. It was First Officer Murdoch. He never failed an exam. That's why he's an incredibly capable officer, and why it seems so unfair that he had the watch when the iceberg collision took place. I always feel for him because he is almost overqualified. In fact, he even skipped his master's qualification, went straight to extra masters.
Wow.
Because obviously he had the ability, and he never, Captain Smith failed. He failed at least once in navigation on one of his qualifications. So that wasn't unusual. A lot of the other officers also failed in navigation, but Murdoch never did. But yeah, once they had these Board of Trade qualifications, in particular their masters, then they were in line to get employment by the White Star Line, because they were looking for officers with that qualification, as well as also R&R officers. So if you had Royal Navy Reserve and you had a master's certificate, then you were in line to then get a nice prestigious job of a White Star Line officer.
Did they try to keep crews together, or maybe like captains and first officers in that sort of professional bond way, or was it much more sort of not freestyle, but sort of like, here's who's available to do this line?
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, you do see some, like, for example, Lightoller and Murdoch were quite good friends because they were on several ships together at the same time. And I guess in the same line, like the White Star Line, obviously the chances are you're going to be working together at some point, maybe a couple of times. But one thing that does happen is you do see this kind of core group that forms with Captain Smith, where he obviously sort of forms a comfortable working relationship with certain officers. Chief Officer Wilde, First Officer Murdoch. Lightoller not so much. Lightoller was one of the new boys for the Titanic. Same with Lowe. Lowe wasn't particularly well known to Smith, but Smith, Wilde, and Murdoch in particular had worked together several times on the Olympic, Titanic's older sister ship, and also the Oceanic, which was the ship before that. And so you do see this kind of working relationship. It actually caused an interesting situation because only a few days before the Titanic sailed, First Officer Murdoch was actually chief officer. And he'd waited all his, he'd waited quite a few years to get this rank of chief officer, and he was more than qualified for it. And then suddenly, at the last moment, Chief Officer Henry Wilde was then made chief officer, and it bumped down Murdoch, Lightoller, and actually another officer, David Blair, got bumped off completely. It didn't even sail. So it's quite interesting.
Sure, they were all absolutely thrilled with that and completely fine and very, very excited to be demoted.
Well, maybe Blair, because he kind of missed out. But Murdoch and Lightoller weren't happy, and it does kind of create some what ifs, because if that hadn't happened, it would have been Lightoller that was on watch when the iceberg collision took place. So you kind of wonder what he would have done, because he would have been first officer. But it is interesting because a lot of people say, well, why did Wilde get brought in at the last moment? What was it because Smith liked Wilde better? But in actual fact, it's more logistics. There's only a certain number of ships sailing, and at the time that there was it was just at the end of a coal strike, so there were some sort of issues with numbers and what have you. So it's sometimes just pure logistics. A lot of people also say, well, why didn't any of the surviving officers become captains? And people say, "Oh, is it because that was the Titanic curse?" And I'm like, "Well, no, it's just logistics, really. When you look at it, that you've got this large pool of officers, only a certain number can be captains. It's not possible that everyone can have a chance at being captain. So it's just logic. I mean, in actual fact, Boxall he wasn't captain, so called, but he did become quite high ranking. And Lightoller, I think, would have been captain if he hadn't quit the White Star Line so early.
Right.
So I don't see any evidence of a curse, but it's just that simple logistics of how many you can actually get to be captain.
Right. I think that people could speculate about liking someone more, or he preferred Wilde to these guys or whatever, but you're right. A large part of it was probably just there's X amount of ships and Y amount of crew. This is what needs to happen. This is just logistics.
And in the case of Wilde, I mean, something I found out which wasn't widely known was that he actually knew that he was joining Titanic like end of March. A lot of people think it just was a last minute because the actual bumping of the officers took place on the 9th, like the day before the Titanic sailed. But in actual fact, Wilde knew about it in March. He wrote a letter. So it was he was basically in line to be captain of his own ship. And because of the coal strike situation, that just didn't happen. So I can kind of see the HQ in Liverpool at the time saying, well, look, okay, why don't we get Wilde, because he's very experienced with the Olympic. Let's get him on board the Titanic just to ensure that everything runs smoothly. It wasn't like a vote of no confidence in Murdoch. It was just pure logistics, and Murdoch had to kind of take that. And it's another thing that kind of adds to this psychology that I feel that Murdoch could have felt quite hard done by. Like, it wasn't his fault. It was just the way that the cards were shuffled and the way things turned out.
Yeah, I could see feeling a little bitter about that, especially when in the middle of everything, where it's like I was supposed to not even be in this position, and then I was here. It happened during my watch, and everything's happening, and there's not enough boats, and everything's overwhelming. And the way that you describe the trauma of their surviving officers, the trauma was formed during the sinking, and maybe could have been any one of them that just reached an absolute end and just was done with everything that was happening. Yeah,
absolutely. I kind of sense, I mean, in his letters he does express disappointment, but I can kind of sense, the sort of the sense of injustice that he must have felt, like, that he was the most capable officer, I personally believe, aboard Titanic, more capable than Smith. I mean, it's interesting that that Murdoch came from a family of seafarers. The sea was in his blood. But if you look at Captain Smith, he actually came from a landlocked town, and he was the son of a greengrocer and potter. You know, absolutely no connection to the sea at all. It just happened that his mother remarried, and his step brother was a captain, and so he got kind of fast tracked into you know, it's not what you know, it's who you know kind of thing, and he got fast tracked into the seafaring world. But it wasn't in his blood like I certainly think that Murdoch did. I mean, Murdoch's family, his father was a captain, his great-grandfather was a captain. The whole family are just seafarers. And so many of them died. You know, back then it wasn't unusual to have a lot of family lost at sea.
Sure. Especially if you're a seafaring family.
So I kind of sense that, you know, injustice, that why is it that the most capable officer does, you know, really got dealt a bad hand.
Yeah. It is disappointing, and you know, it's disappointing when you think maybe if he'd survived, he could have gone on to have a different career. If, you know, Titanic hadn't sunk, they could have all had exceptionally bright careers, especially after having that in their resumes. Did they use resumes?
I'm not sure they would use that term back then, but they did have. I've got copies of White Star records for each one. That they kept a record. It's not particularly accurate, I found, but. It does
sounds like my records.
It does list each ship that they sailed on, and I personally find that quite interesting to sort of track all the ships that they worked aboard. You can kind of see the trajectory of smaller vessels, larger vessels, you know, vessels carrying cargo, then moving on to passengers. You know, you sort of see that progress that they make as they go through life, and it's quite fascinating.
I'm sure that Smith probably has the most ships behind his name, but outside of him, would it have been Murdoch of the crew who had the most extensive ship list? I need to find out what the term is.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure. I mean, I guess just in terms of his age, Smith would his career was longer. And I guess that then the next two officers, who were about 40, were Murdoch and Lightoller, so they would have probably something similar. Actually, Anne Wilde was also same age. So I think, there was not really anyone. I mean, Smith is an interesting one because some people believe that he had like a career of mishaps, with a lot of things going wrong. But when you actually look into it, he was quite a capable captain. I going back to what I said about not having the sea in his blood, I certainly believe that's true. But he did become quite a capable captain. He was known for doing some quite tricky navigational moves. But he's kind of sort of had a bit of an unfair, image, I guess, because not only of the Titanic disaster, most notably, but also just before that there was the Olympic collision. With a naval vessel that he was ultimately blamed for. But it's interesting that in the case of both of the Olympic collision and then Titanic's near collision with the SS New York on its departure, it was actually not him in command. It was the Trinity House pilot, a compulsory pilot that would guide ships out of port because they knew the ports really well. So when you came into port or out of port, you had what was known as a compulsory pilot who would come on board and would then take command of the ship to bring it into dock. And so in the case of the Olympics collision, it was a Trinity House pilot in command. And the case of the Titanic's near collision on its departure, again, it was not Smith, it was the pilot. So I kind of feel that he kind of gets this unfair rap because of some mistakes made by other people. But it is, of course, you have to take responsibility as captain, master and commander. You have to take responsibility for whatever your officers decide to do.
Sure.
But maybe it wasn't him, his exact, ineptitude. It was just someone else's.
Do you think a lot of that might have to do with the sort of lack of benefit of the doubt on the rewatch of his life, sort of, and that it's easy for everyone to sit here with, our GPS and our our sonar cameras and think, well, I wouldn't have done X, Y, and Z. But as you said, he was very much operating by the standards of his time. In addition to that,
well, absolutely, and I kind of think there's a human desire for kind of finding a villain, putting a face to a villain, and Smith has become that. And it also, if it's not Smith, then it's some conspiracy theory where it was, some insurance scam. You try to put some kind of villainous slant on things because we tend to try to find structure and chaos. And right. I kind of, it's another of my interests is debunking conspiracy theories about the Titanic. But Smith has certainly been villainized for the disaster, and also the cinematic portrayal of him often is like, as soon as the ship hits the iceberg, he becomes almost comatose. He's just sort of staggering around doing nothing. When in actual fact, in my research, he was very active. He was going around doing lots. He was getting information. He was doing research. He was liaising with the wireless operators, with Thomas Andrews, with Boxall to get the distress position. He was very busy. He didn't have time to be standing around looking shocked.
Sure.
But again, Cameron did that because it's a character portrayal, isn't it? It does fit what people expect, I guess.
Right.
But the reality is, I'm sure he was in shock, but I think he was he was too busy to be comatose.
All these, excuse me, and all these minute by minute sort of retellings and all of the research, where's the last concrete time we're able to verify where Smith was? Because at a certain point he just seems to vanish, or all the accounts afterwards are so and so saw him do this, but this other person saw him jumping into the water, but the other person saw him heading to the bridge. There's all this conflicting testimony, but what is the last thing that we can verify he did that night during the sinking?
Well, if we're talking about his death, what you described, him jumping off the bridge, is the last known reported eyewitness account of him.
That is really what happened.
There are some accounts that I personally have found them to be rather dubious, of him bringing a baby or child to upturn life collapsible B. I kind of find that a little bit of a sort of a convenient story. It does sound quite heroic, and there's some sort of wonderful paintings that portray this.
Sure.
But I'm quite doubtful. I mean, I guess it's possible, but the accounts, they're just not credible enough in my book. But the most credible account we do have of his end is him jumping off the bridge. He's shown in Cameron's film, of course, in the wheelhouse.
Yes.
Which, he was in that area, but I don't think he would have just been standing in the wheelhouse. I think there is a report of him and also possibly Thomas Andrews diving off at that point as the bridge area went under. I mean, this was their home. The bridge area, the navigational bridge, is their home. It's where he lives, slept, worked. It's
right.
And so when that went under, that was it. That was the end for him, really. And so to me, that isn't surprising. There are reports of a suicide, of him going into a library and drinking and shooting himself. But again, these are all sort of very tabloid accounts of what people think may have happened. There were a lot of things negative about him, like that he was drinking. Well, yeah, he did drink a little at dinner, because that wasn't unusual. He did drink a little bit. And he had to have dinner. That was expected. That was part of what he did as the captain. He didn't go to sleep. A lot of people say that he was asleep when the collision took place. Well, actually, he was on the bridge. His cabin is actually part of the bridge. That's where he was, and his last instructions were, "Let me know if there's anything doubtful." So he was there, ready to respond. So I think those who say that he was asleep at the time of the collision, I mean, it's possible he was asleep, but there's no way we'll know, and there's no evidence to say that. I think he was probably in the chart room calculating their projected course at that time. That's my personal take on it. People who want him to be asleep are obviously looking for a negative, slant on his life because, oh yes, he was asleep when the collision took place. But, let's just be reasonable. He didn't have to be asleep. It was 20 to midnight, did he go to bed that early? I don't know.
Even if he did, I was just going to say, everyone has to sleep. So what if he was asleep? If that was his allotted watch time to sleep, then that's what he should have been doing during that time.
It's true.
You can't have you don't want someone who's running on 0 hours of sleep helming anything, let alone a passenger vessel in ice.
Yeah, I guess what it does is it kind of exposes the sort of the mentality of those who say, "Oh, he was asleep," and that kind of negative framing of what he was doing.
That's true.
And I it's more of an insight into their take on his life than anything else. But you're right. I mean, everyone needs to sleep. I mean, Lightoller was asleep. I mean, Fifth Officer Lowe famously said that when we sleep, we die. Because they're on like 4-hour shifts. So they have like 4 hours on and then 4 hours sleep and then 4 hours on again. I mean, that's a pretty harsh existence. So when they did they had that 4 hours sleep, they really had to sleep. They couldn't read a book. It was like, what, get your sleep in. So, Lowe said, when we sleep, we die.
That makes sense. And I don't know. I never saw him being as potentially asleep as negative personally, but I think again, my grandfather's a surgeon and my dad's a professor. I've been around people who don't know how to balance a sleep schedule. They even need to take naps once in a while. Just you can't be constantly going, especially when you're in charge of that many people, not just your crew, but then the passengers. It's a lot of responsibility to have on someone who's not allotted any sleep at all.
And you think about it, I mean, that is the job of a captain, is to delegate, isn't it? So, he had delegated what they call an officer of the watch. So the next officer in command was First Officer Murdoch, the most capable officer, I believe, on the Titanic. So, in his mind, it's in safe hands. And what he would do is they call it night orders. He would have left Murdoch with night orders, which were to maintain speed and course unless the conditions change. Then to notify him immediately, and then that would potentially would then change. So, in all honesty, he's still master and commander, but he's delegated that to his officer of the watch.
Yeah, and it doesn't. At least in my personal understanding, there doesn't seem, in my opinion, to be enough evidence to say that anyone was willfully negligent or like cruelly negligent in this.
No, I don't believe. I mean, this is something that where I stick my neck out again. I haven't got any death threats yet, but you never know. Where I don't believe that there is any negligence. It's so easy to take the tabloid headline, they were sailing too fast, they ignored ice warnings. Actually, they didn't ignore ice warnings, and they were not sailing too fast. Those two tabloid headlines are actually wrong, because just on the ice warnings, actually they had plotted the ice and they knew that they were going to reach it by 11 o'clock. So if they had ignored the ice warnings, well, then how did they plot ice and know they're going to reach it by 11 o'clock? They knew about the ice, and they had made the decision based on the conditions that the ice would be viewable, be able to be seen in time for them to alter course, and that maintaining speed would ensure they were out of the danger zone sooner, and that they would be more maneuverable. And this was common, and even now you'll find that ships in clear visible conditions will maintain speed. And the Titanic it was in clear visible conditions. There was nothing impeding their vision. So the protocol of the time was to maintain speed, not put on extra lookouts, because if it's clear visible conditions, the lookouts will see it. And this is the kind of the irony, of course, is that that didn't happen, and retrospectively we say, oh, why didn't they slow down? And it's so easy to do that, but the reality is actually based on what they knew at the time before 11:40 p.m. they were doing the right thing in their mind.
I feel as though that might be the crux of the point of this entire discussion, is that as far as they were aware and via the standards of the time, they were doing what they were supposed to be doing, if not more.
And in all honesty, if some kind of butterfly effect, they had just avoided that iceberg, I mean, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Titanic would be an unknown ship. It would have just, So it's only because of what happened. That hindsight is 2020 adage. It's only because of what happened that we look back and go, oh, why didn't they do this? And that was terrible that they did that. When in actual fact, they were doing that all the time. And all the
Right.
ships in the area were doing the same. A lot of people say, well, what about the California? It stopped. Well, yes, it stopped because it saw ice. So did the Titanic. It stopped when it saw ice, but the outcome was different.
Yeah,
So-
they just happened to see the ice after or as they collided with it, really. If they'd seen it sooner, I'm sure that they probably would have really pumped the brakes. I don't think they would have seen it coming and gone, huh, that looks bad.
I mean, just quickly on that point, one of the things that Murdoch was often accused of, unfairly, is that he put the engines full astern, which would then reduce the turning power. And you'll see that in James Cameron's film, where it's quite a dramatic moment where the engines are put into reverse and all that.
Yes.
And it's great, the music and everything. But in actual fact, that didn't happen. He did not put the engines full astern because, yes, that would have... Well, there's two reasons. Mechanically, it wouldn't have been possible to do that in time.
Sure.
By the time that they started reversing, that it would have been too late. And secondly, it would have reduced their turning power. And Murdoch was a very capable officer. He would have known that. He was on the starboard wing bridge. He would have seen the iceberg. He would have judged the distances and gone, right, we're going to go hard to starboard, which is actually hard to port. And then, he's going to give it his best shot, which is what he did.
Yeah.
He didn't put it full astern. There's no evidence of a full astern order. It's thanks to Fourth Officer Boxall who came up with this full astern thing, and Lightoller kind of repeated it, and others repeated it afterwards. But in actual fact, there's no evidence of a full astern order at all. So another one of those things where Murdoch has been misrepresented.
And that's, one of those things that, again, you kind of wish that everyone was privy to these facts and could form slightly more positive or neutral opinions. But at the end of the day, I'm lucky that I decided to look a little beyond the Cameron film. But for some people, they have their one interaction with that film or whatever book or movie they're reading, and then they just move on. And that's the impression that they're formed with.
And of course, you have to look at the Cameron film as a product of its time, 1997 or 96.
Also true.
Is that the research wasn't there, that the full astern order was never given, and so Cameron made the call based on what he knew at the time. I think now he wouldn't do that, but it is still a very dramatic sequence. I love it personally.
It's a great sequence.
So I'd kind of in a way it'd be a shame to see the full astern order not given because it's such a dramatic moment. But the reality is that it didn't happen.
Yeah, and I mean, it works in the film in the same way that having, Cal and Hockley being a melodramatic villain bribing officers as a ship's going down and the boats are all leaving is also a dramatic choice. But I think that they work in the same way that you were saying the score. I love the score. It works in that moment. It makes it super dramatic just to hear everyone's silent and then screaming orders. It just works. And we have the benefit of knowing that that's not what actually happened, but for a film, you're right. It would be a shame to not have that in there. It's a great sequence.
Well, as long as we don't use it to then, knock them. Because I get comments on the YouTube channels that I run and what have you, people saying, "Oh, he shouldn't have put it full astern," and I'm like, well, just I politely put, just do the research because actually he didn't. But because a lot of people want to find reason to find fault, and
Right.
say, well, they should have done this, they should have done that, these keyboard warriors who have all the answers, and don't realize, well, if you're actually in their shoes, it would be quite a different story. You've got to think on your feet, and the decision he made, the harder starboard order, he almost pulled off a miracle. I mean, researchers all agree on this, that he almost pulled off an amazing maneuver. It's just that there was possibly an ice shelf or something that caused some kind of grounding to take place.
Right.
And again, it's going. I don't like to use the term, but unlucky. That he almost pulled it off, but he was just unlucky.
Yeah, he was unlucky, and he and Lightoller both worked really hard to save a lot of lives as the sinking went down. And again, it's unfortunate we lost as many people as we did and as many of their stories as we did, but I'm really glad for people, especially like you, who are really bringing these stories out to life, because I'll admit I hadn't thought too much about it, but I'm glad to be learning about these men and their stories and their histories.
And there's so much more to learn. I mean, every day I'm discovering new things. I run a Facebook group actually for the Titanic officers. It's just hit 3,000 today. Actually, I noted.
Ooh, I'm going to go join.
But anyway, on that, there's always other researchers, not just myself, who are posting stuff that they've discovered, new pictures of different officers. The Captain Smith just recently, some pictures that we'd never seen before of him. There's always something new to discover and learn, and I think also to keep open-minded about it. Like we often come with all this baggage, all these kind of like negative ideas about this and that, perhaps based on films or just based on our own take on things. But if we keep an open mind, there's a lot to learn. And the story is far more interesting. It's not maybe as dramatic. There wasn't some big insurance scam switch or whatever. But, you know, I mean, and the Titanic, you know, if you look at it, actually, it was quite a mundane sailing. You know, there was nothing really special about it, except for what happened. But when you look at it that way, but actually, to me, that it becomes far more interesting, the fact that it was a mundane sailing and that it was just kind of, everything was going by the book, and then suddenly it all goes wrong. Is to me actually more of an interesting story than a huge insurance scam.
I agree, and I've officially now kept you for a long time, and I happen to know if I don't cut these off, I will talk for hours, and I would like you to go to bed at some point in time because we were just talking about sleep.
Oh, I happily go without. I think I can. Yeah, 4 hours is enough for me.
All right, well, go take your watch, but and thank you so much for coming on. I really can't overstate how amazing it was to talk to you. I learned a lot. It dissuaded a lot of notions I had. I hope that I'm now more open-minded when I approach these things.
Sounds good. Well, I hope it was useful. I probably waffled too much, but I don't know.
You absolutely did not.
I'm kind of half asleep, sort of sleepwalking or sleep talking. So hopefully it was sort of intelligible.
It was fine.
And I probably made some terrible errors in there that I'll be you know, brought to what's the word? You know.
Oh my gosh, guys, Dan was it was an amazing conversation, and I'm so grateful that he came on the show. If you want to get in touch with him, please do. He has a few different websites. You can go to the one we talked about in this episode, williammurdoch.net, which talks about First Officer William Murdoch. He also has TitanicOfficers.com about officers of the Titanic, as well as Carpathia and Californian, and TitanicSwitch.com, and that completely debunks the super stupid Titanic switch theory. You can also find him on the Facebook group, which is facebook.com/group/Titanic Officers, all one word, which is the official group on the officers. He's also on YouTube, youtube.com/user/WilliamMurdoch.net. That's spelled out William Murdoch, DOTNET. Titanic Officers, youtube.com/Titanics Officers, TITANICSOFFICERS. You can find him on his Switch channel as well. And other than that, please get in touch with him however you see fit. And I hope to see you guys in the next one. And like I said before, if I find out that anyone who's listening to the show has sent anything unkind Dan's way or the way of anyone else who has been on my show, I will be fucking furious, okay? That's just not what this thing is for. That's not what the show is for. And that is not what the community I'm trying to foster is for. If you want to go argue with people, there are plenty of places on the internet to do that. With the people of my show and context of my show is absolutely not the place. If you want to argue with me, go ahead. But leave the guests and listeners alone. That's not what they're here for, and honestly, I hope that's not what you're here for either. But either way, I want to thank Dan again for coming on. It was an amazing conversation. I hope to talk to him again in the future, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.